The sales register from the Port District of Saint-Pierre, preserved in the National Overseas Archives, contains an entry that still sparks debate among historians today. December 7, 1842, Lot 43, man approximately 32 years old, unknown origin. The following note, written in faded ink by an auctioneer named Adrien Lefebvre, indicates the highest bid was withdrawn, and the sale concluded under a protocol where the buyer was warned of documented anomalies at a price of 2,000 francs, significantly below market value for a man in the prime of his life. What made this entry extraordinary was not the ridiculously low price, though that alone raises questions. It was the 17 pages of testimony stapled to the register, a collection of accounts from 3 former owners, 2 ship captains, a Catholic priest, and a gendarme, all describing the same impossible phenomenon. The man they were selling could read and write in 7 languages, performed mathematical calculations in moments that took qualified engineers hours, recited entire books after hearing them once, and demonstrated knowledge in astronomy, navigation, medicine, and law that rivaled that of university professors. In Martinique, such abilities in an enslaved person were not just unusual. According to every witness who had encountered him, they were impossible. Adrien Lefebvre had managed slave auctions in Saint-Pierre for 11 years. The Port District, which locals called the Guerche, handled thousands of transactions each year, making Saint-Pierre the beating heart of human trafficking in the French West Indies. Lefebvre prided himself on knowing his merchandise, assessing value at a glance, understanding exactly what buyers wanted and how to present it. He had sold laborers, domestics, skilled artisans, and children. Each transaction was documented with the same professional detachment that characterized all human commerce at that time. But on the morning of December 7, 1842, Lefebvre stood in his office holding documents that made his hands tremble. The man designated as Lot 43 had arrived 3 days earlier on a steamer from Guadeloupe, accompanied by papers unlike any Lefebvre had seen in his career. The seller, a merchant named Rochefort, who operated between Basse-Terre and Fort Royal, had included written warnings from every person who had previously owned or transported this particular enslaved man. The testimonies read like feverish fantasies, claims so extraordinary that Lefebvre's first instinct was to dismiss them as an elaborate fraud. Then he met the man himself, and everything changed. His name in the sales catalog was simply Barnabé, although the papers suggested it was the 4th or 5th name he had been given. No surname, no clear origin, just Barnabé, male, age estimated between 30 and 35 based on physical examination. He measured approximately 1.80 meters, was well-muscled without excess, with hands that showed calluses from manual labor, but also the meticulous care of someone who valued his physical condition. His face bore no distinctive scars, no marks of punishment or rebellion. What distinguished him was something far more subtle and infinitely more disturbing. His eyes possessed an awareness that made Lefebvre deeply uncomfortable. Most enslaved people who passed through the Saint-Pierre auction houses had learned to carefully manage their expressions. Some showed resignation. Others carefully concealed their anger. Many displayed the practiced emptiness that came from years of surveillance and punishment. Barnabé showed none of that. When Lefebvre questioned him in the holding area, preparing the standard evaluation for potential buyers, Barnabé had looked at him with calm, direct attention and answered every question in perfect French, his vocabulary and pronunciation matching that of any educated gentleman Lefebvre had ever met. "Where were you born?" Lefebvre asked, following his usual script. "I do not know, sir," Barnabé replied, his voice carrying neither defiance nor subservience, just a simple statement of fact. "My earliest memories are of a plantation in Guadeloupe, but I was told I originally came from elsewhere. No one seemed certain of the details." "Can you read?" A slight silence, then, "Yes, sir." "How did you learn?" "I taught myself, sir, by observing letters and words, understanding structures, practicing when I could." Lefebvre put down his pen then, studying Barnabé more intently. Self-taught literacy was not impossible among enslaved people, but it was rare and dangerous. Most plantation owners explicitly forbade education, understanding that reading opened doors to ideas, resistance, and hope. "The papers I received about you contain unusual claims," Lefebvre said, choosing his words carefully. "Claims about your abilities that seem frankly impossible. I need to understand what is true and what is exaggerated before I can sell you. Honestly, what do the papers say, sir?" What do the papers? That you speak several languages, that you can perform complex mathematical calculations, that you have demonstrated knowledge in areas no enslaved person should have access to, that you have made predictions about events that proved accurate, that you have solved problems that experienced overseers and plantation managers could not solve. Lefebvre leaned forward. Are these claims true? Barnabé held his gaze with that unsettling candor. I can speak French, Spanish, German, Latin, and a little Greek in addition to English, sir. I can perform calculations involving multiplication, division, fractions, and basic algebra. I have studied, through observation and limited access to books, subjects such as astronomy, navigation, human anatomy, agricultural sciences, and law. As for predictions, I have sometimes noticed patterns that others missed and have mentioned what might follow from them. As to whether that constitutes a prediction, I cannot say. The calm, precise manner in which he delivered his information, as if describing the weather, had dried Lefebvre's throat. How? He asked. How is all this possible? I remember everything I see or hear, sir, Barnabé simply said. Every conversation, every word in every book I have glimpsed, every calculation I have watched someone else perform, my mind retains information as a ledger retains numbers. I cannot explain why this is true. I only know it has been true for as long as I can remember. Lefebvre ended the interview shortly after, needing time to process what he had just heard. He spent the next 2 days reading the testimonies, and each one confirmed what Barnabé had described, often with additional details that made the phenomenon even more inexplicable. The first testimony came from a plantation owner in Guadeloupe named Monsieur de Valois, who had bought Barnabé at a sale in Marie-Galante in 1837. Valois' letter, written to the merchant who would later sell Barnabé, explained what had happened during the 16 months Barnabé had lived on his sugarcane plantation. I bought him as a strong laborer, Valois wrote. Robust, healthy, without defect. I assigned him to my harvesting team. Within 3 days, my overseer noticed Barnabé had observed the other workers for perhaps 6 hours in total, then began working with an efficiency that surpassed men who had been doing this job for 20 years. He wasted no movement, damaged no cane, finished rows faster than anyone, while maintaining superior quality. The letter continued. I attributed this to simple aptitude until my overseer mentioned that Barnabé had corrected him on the timing of the harvest. We had planned to cut a particular plot on Thursday. Barnabé had discreetly suggested, when asked his opinion, that waiting until Saturday would yield better results based on the weather patterns he had observed and the moisture content of the leaves. My overseer, being questioned by an enslaved person, had ignored the advice. The Thursday harvest went poorly due to unexpected humidity. Saturday's weather was perfect, exactly as Barnabé had predicted. Valois's letter became more detailed from that point on. Within 6 weeks, Barnabé had demonstrated knowledge of crop rotation, soil enrichment, pest management, and harvesting techniques that matched the information in the agricultural journals to which Valois subscribed. When questioned, Barnabé explained that he had briefly glimpsed these journals while delivering firewood to Valois' office and had memorized their contents. I tested this claim, he wrote. I showed him a page from a journal on tobacco cultivation. I let him look at it for about 30 seconds. Then I took it away and asked him to recite what he had read. He repeated the entire page word for word, including footnotes and citations. I showed him a mathematical table used to calculate yield projections. He glanced at it, then performed mental calculations faster than I could with a pen and paper, and his answers were correct every time. The conclusion of the letter explained why Valois had sold Barnabé despite his obvious value. I could not keep him. The other enslaved people began turning to him for advice, treating his words with a deference that undermined my overseer's authority. Worse, Barnabé's knowledge made him dangerous. He understood laws, property rights, navigation, and geography too well. He could read contracts better than my notary. He corrected my physician's diagnosis of a worker's illness and suggested a treatment that proved effective. I realized I was housing someone whose intelligence surpassed my own, who understood systems and patterns I could barely grasp, and who remained enslaved solely because of the color of his skin and the legal structures that supported that bondage. The situation seemed increasingly unstable. I sold him to a merchant in Saint-Pierre for a substantial profit, although I suspect I should have warned the buyer more explicitly about what he was acquiring. The second testimony came from that merchant, a man named Rochefort, who had owned Barnabé for only 8 weeks before reselling him. Rochefort's letter was shorter, but more agitated in tone. Valois told me Barnabé was exceptionally intelligent, Rochefort wrote. I assumed he meant cunning, perhaps clever, in the way some enslaved people learn to manipulate situations to their advantage. I did not understand what Valois truly meant until Barnabé had been in my house for 3 days. I employed him as a general laborer, but he spent time near my office where I conducted my business. One evening, he discreetly mentioned that I was making an error in my accounting, that the figures I had recorded for a recent shipment did not match the weight I had been given. I checked my calculations. He was right. I had transposed 2 figures in a calculation involving several thousand francs. Rochefort's letter described a growing unease as Barnabé's abilities became more apparent. He speaks French better than my wife, who studied it at a reputable institution. He can calculate exchange rates between currencies faster than my banker. He once mentioned in passing that a particular ship I was considering for transport had structural weaknesses in its hull based on how it floated, and suggested I choose another vessel. I dismissed this as presumption, but I later learned that the ship had developed leaks during its voyage and barely reached port. How did he know? He claimed to have observed the ship's waterline and understood what that implied about the vessel's construction and loading. The letter concluded, I sold him because I found myself unconsciously beginning to rely on his judgment. I found myself asking for his opinion before making business decisions. This is intolerable. A man cannot function as a merchant when his enslaved person understands trade better than he does. I sold him to a merchant heading for the interior of Martinique, hoping that distance would end my discomfort. I provided the documentation on his abilities because I felt the buyer deserved to know what he was purchasing. Although I am not certain anyone can truly prepare for the experience of owning someone like Barnabé. The third testimony came from the captain of the steamer that had transported Barnabé from Guadeloupe to Martinique. Captain Moreau's account was the most disturbing. Barnabé was kept below deck with the rest of the cargo for most of the voyage, Moreau wrote. On the second day, we encountered navigation difficulties. A storm had altered our course, and my navigator struggled to determine our exact position using celestial observations. The mathematics were complex, involving multiple calculations to account for drift and currents. We were debating our position when Barnabé, who was sitting quietly nearby in chains, spoke up. He said, based on what he had heard from our observations and the time elapsed since the storm, that we were approximately southeast of our intended position. My navigator dismissed this as impossible given the complexity of the calculation. We completed our own calculations over the next hour and determined our position. Barnabé had been accurate to within 3 leagues despite the absence of instruments, maps, and any formal training in navigation. Moreau's letter continued. I questioned him at length after that incident. He explained that he had learned navigation by observing sailors on previous voyages, that he had memorized celestial tables after briefly glimpsing them, and that he could perform the necessary calculations mentally. To test this, I gave him complex mathematical problems that normally required written work. He solved them instantly, showing me the steps mentally in a way that suggested he was reading the calculations from an internal ledger. I have sailed for 30 years and encountered many educated men. Barnabé's abilities surpassed them all. By the time we reached Saint-Pierre, I was deeply troubled. A man with his intelligence should not exist in chains, and yet he was there, legally property, headed for auction like livestock. Lefebvre had read the testimonies several times, each reading making him more certain of one thing. Barnabé would be almost impossible to sell. Most buyers wanted strong, obedient, and simple laborers. Intelligence in an enslaved person made owners nervous, created management problems, and suggested a potential for rebellion or escape. Extraordinary intelligence, such as Barnabé apparently possessed, would be absolutely terrifying to anyone who understood its implications. He called his associate, a slave merchant named Beaumont, who had more experience with unusual cases. They discussed the situation over a cognac in Lefebvre's office, trying to determine how to handle the sale. You could simply lie, Beaumont said. Don't mention the papers. Sell him as a standard laborer and let the buyer discover the truth later. That's fraud, Lefebvre replied, and it's dangerous. If these abilities become evident and the buyer learns that I knew and did not disclose it, I will lose all my clients. Reputation matters in this business. Then disclose everything and accept that you will only get a fraction of his value. Most planters will not want to touch him once they understand what they are buying. Why not? He has value. His skills could improve any estate. Beaumont gave him a pitying look. Because he has too much value, Adrian. an enslaved person who can outthink his master, who understands systems better than the people who control them, who can predict outcomes and solve problems at a level beyond trained professionals. That's not a laborer, that's a threat to the entire structure. Do you think plantation owners want their enslaved people to realize how arbitrary their bondage is? Do you think they want someone capable of explaining property law, calculating exact distances to free islands, speaking multiple languages to communicate with potential allies, and remembering every detail of every conversation he overhears? Barnabé is not just intelligent, he is dangerously intelligent, and everyone who has owned him has eventually realized it. The conversation ended with Lefebvre's acceptance that Barnabé would be sold below his value to whoever was willing to accept the risk. He prepared the auction announcement with full disclosure, attaching all testimonies and adding his own summary of what he had observed during his interview with Barnabé. The description ended with a warning he had never used before. The buyer assumes full responsibility for managing unusual abilities. No refunds or exchanges will be offered regardless of subsequent difficulties. The auction itself began. The morning of December 7th dawned clear and fresh, a typical day for Martinique's mild winters. The Guilherche quay was bustling with merchants, sailors, and planters who had come to town for business. Lefebvre's auction house filled with the usual crowd of buyers, men from scattered plantations across the island, seeking laborers to expand their operations or replace those who had been sold, died, or escaped. The morning proceeded through the first 42 lots without incident. Men and women stood on the platform, were examined, questioned, and sold to the highest bidder. Prices were normal for the season. Strong men sold for between 4,500 and 6,000 francs, women slightly less. Children were assessed based on age and potential. Then Lefebvre called for lot 43. 2 guards brought Barnabé onto the platform. He walked without resistance, his movements controlled and deliberate. He wore simple work clothes, reasonably clean, and his physical condition was excellent. Under normal circumstances, he would have attracted aggressive bidding, strong, healthy, at the ideal working age, with no visible defects. But Lefebvre had distributed copies of the testimonies that morning to serious buyers, and the atmosphere in the room had changed as the men read the documents. By the time Barnabé stood on the platform, most buyers had moved to the back of the room, or left entirely. Only 7 remained in a position to bid, and 4 of them seemed uncertain. Lot 43, Lefebvre announced, his voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm that sounded increasingly hollow even to his own ears. Man approximately 32 years old, excellent physical condition, experienced in agricultural and general labor. He paused, then added the required disclosure. As indicated in the documentation provided this morning, this lot exhibits unusual intellectual abilities. All buyers have been informed of his abilities and the associated testimonies. Special conditions apply. All sales are final regardless of subsequent management difficulties. A murmur ran through the remaining crowd. A man near the front turned and exited immediately. Another followed. 5 potential buyers remained. Barnabé stood in the center of the platform, his expression calm, his posture neither defiant nor submissive, just still. His eyes scanned the crowd with what appeared to be moderate interest, as if observing a theatrical performance that did not particularly concern him. "Let us begin at 3,000 francs, Lefebvre said, setting the starting bid lower than he would for a standard laborer, recognizing the risk buyers would be taking. Silence. None of the 5 raised a hand. 2,500, Lefebvre tried, lowering the price to a level that should have seemed a steal for someone of Barnabé's apparent value. Still silence. One of the remaining buyers shook his head and headed for the exit. 2,000, Lefebvre said, now genuinely desperate. Gentlemen, at this price you are essentially buying him at half his physical value alone, without even considering his other abilities. A hand went up at the back of the room. Lefebvre felt relief wash over him. "We have 2,000 francs from the gentleman at the back. Anyone for 2,200? The 3 other remaining buyers exchanged glances, but none raised a hand. They were done. 2,000 francs once, 2,000 francs twice. Lefebvre's hammer fell. Sold to Monsieur Edouard de Montagnac of Belle Alliance Plantation for 2,000 francs. The transaction was completed within the hour. Montagnac, a wealthy planter who owned 2,500 hectares of sugar land about 50 kilometers inland from Saint-Pierre, signed the purchase documents without expression. When Lefebvre offered him the testimonies, attached one last time, Montagnac waved them away. "I read them," he said. "I understand what I am buying." "So, you understand the risks?" "I understand that someone extraordinarily valuable is being sold for a fraction of his worth because other men lack the courage to manage unusual circumstances. I built my fortune by recognizing opportunities others miss. This man's intelligence is not a problem, it is an asset if managed correctly." Lefebvre had wanted to warn him further, had wanted to explain that 3 distinct owners had all come to the same conclusion, that Barnabé was ultimately unsustainable. But Montagnac's confidence was absolute. He arranged for transport and left with Barnabé in a cart heading inland, the most intelligent enslaved person ever sold in Saint-Pierre, leaving the auction house in chains, while his new owner smiled with satisfaction at the deal he had just concluded. Lefebvre watched them leave from his office window, feeling an unease he could not quite name. He had sold thousands of human beings during his career, each transaction documented with professional detachment. But something about this sale seemed different, seemed wrong, in a way that had nothing to do with the usual injustice of the slave trade itself. He returned to his desk and wrote a brief note in his personal journal, a practice he kept separate from official records. December 7, 1842, sold Lot 43, the enslaved man named Barnabé, to Edouard de Montagnac for 2,000 francs, the lowest price received for a man in the prime of his life in 5 years. Montagnac was delighted with his purchase. I cannot shake the feeling that he should not be. Time will tell. Time would indeed tell, though the answer came faster than anyone imagined and proved far more extraordinary than even the testimonies had suggested. Belle Alliance plantation stretched across thousands of hectares of fertile land, its fields extending with geometric precision under the vast tropical sky. Edouard de Montagnac had built this estate in 15 years, starting with 300 hectares inherited from his father and expanding through thoughtful acquisitions and aggressive management. At that time, Belle Alliance supported 100 enslaved people, produced hundreds of barrels of sugar each year, and generated profits that made Montagnac one of the wealthiest planters in the region. He had achieved this success through systematic efficiency. Unlike some owners who relied on excessive violence or chaotic management, Montagnac operated with precision. He employed 3 overseers who reported directly to him, kept detailed records of every aspect of the plantation's operations, and prided himself on understanding his business better than any competitor. His wealth came from knowledge, from seeing market patterns, from optimizing every element of production. He believed that intelligence was the key to success, and he had absolute confidence in his own intellectual superiority. This confidence made him uniquely ill-suited to understand what he had bought in Barnabé. The cart transporting them from Saint-Pierre reached Belle Alliance on the evening of December 7th. Montagnac had spent the journey in silence, reviewing his papers and occasionally glancing at Barnabé, who remained still at the back of the cart, his expression revealing nothing. Upon their arrival, Montagnac called his chief overseer, a methodical man from Provence named Gaspard, who had worked at Belle Alliance for 8 years. "This is Barnabé," Montagnac said. "Assign him first to the main house maintenance team. I want him nearby so I can observe him. Feed him properly. Ensure he is suitably housed. He is not to work as a cane cutter until I have evaluated his abilities." Gaspard studied Barnabé with a practiced evaluation, noting his physical condition, his bearing, the unusual frankness of his gaze. "Special instructions, sir?" "Watch him carefully. Report anything unusual. And Gaspard, make sure the other workers understand he is not to be mistreated. He represents a significant investment, and I want him kept in optimal condition." After Gaspard had taken Barnabé to assign his quarters, Montagnac retreated to his office and poured himself a cognac. He felt the satisfaction of a man who had identified an opportunity where others saw only risk. The testimonies about Barnabé's abilities, instead of frightening him, had excited his competitive instincts. If this man could truly calculate faster than trained engineers, understand complex systems after brief exposure, and demonstrate knowledge surpassing that of educated professionals, then he represented unprecedented value. The other owners had failed to capitalize on Barnabé's intelligence because they had been afraid of it. Montagnac intended to exploit it. The first week passed without incident. Barnabé worked alongside the main house team, performing routine maintenance tasks, cutting wood, assisting with repairs. Gaspar reported that Barnabé worked consistently, never complained, followed every instruction immediately, and remained alone during the little free time granted to workers in the evening. He spoke only when spoken to, answered questions politely, and showed no interest in socializing with the other enslaved people at Belle Alliance. "He is quiet," Gaspar told Montagnac on the 5th day. "Observant, though. I catch him watching how things work, studying the other workers, looking at the plantation as if reading a book. It's not threatening exactly, but it is noticeable." "That is his nature," Montagnac said. "The documentation indicated he absorbs information constantly. Let him observe. I want to understand the full extent of his abilities before I determine how to use him most effectively." On the 8th day, Montagnac decided to test what the testimonies claimed. He called Barnabé into his office after breakfast, a room lined with books on agriculture, law, history, and science. Barnabé entered and stood by the door, waiting with that same calm attention that characterized all his actions. "The men who sold you made extraordinary claims," Montagnac began, sitting behind his desk while Barnabé remained standing. "I have read testimony suggesting you can perform complex calculations mentally, that you speak multiple languages, that you remember everything you encounter. Before I can properly utilize your abilities, I need to verify these claims personally. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Barnabé said, his voice carrying neither pride nor defensiveness. Montagnac pulled out a sheet of paper covered with figures. "Here is a calculation I performed yesterday to project sugar yields based on current plot conditions. It took me about 30 minutes using standard methods. I will read you the variables, and I want you to perform the calculation mentally. You will have no paper or tools, just what you can do in your head. Can you do this?" "I can try, sir." Montagnac read a series of figures. Hectares planted, estimated yield per hectare according to soil quality and rainfall, projected market price, labor and material costs, transportation fees. The calculation required multiple steps of multiplication, division, and subtraction to arrive at a profit estimate. He finished reading the variables and looked up at Barnabé. "Well, the projected profit is 22,734 francs and 20 centimes, sir," Barnabé said immediately, "assuming current market prices hold and no unexpected crop losses occur." Montagnac felt his breath catch. He looked at his own calculation, verified the final figure he had arrived at after 30 minutes of meticulous work. 22,734 francs and 20 centimes. Exactly, how did you do that so quickly?" "I retained each number as you said it, sir. Then I performed the operations in sequence. My mind arranges the figures visually, and I can manipulate them as one might move objects on a desk. I cannot explain the mechanism, only that it has always worked this way." Montagnac put down the paper, his hands less steady than they had been moments before. "The testimonies mentioned you speak several languages. Is that accurate?" "Yes, sir. French, Spanish, German, Latin, and a little Greek in addition to English." "Where did you learn them?" "Various sources, sir. I heard French spoken by a former owner's wife, Spanish from Cuban workers with whom I briefly worked, German from a book I glimpsed for perhaps 20 minutes in an office, Latin and Greek from religious texts and classical works to which I had limited access over the years. Once I understand a language's structure and sufficient vocabulary, I can extrapolate the rest through pattern recognition." It was absurd. Languages required years of study, immersion, practice. Yet Barnabé spoke with the same calm certainty he had used to solve the mathematical problem. Montagnac switched to Spanish, asking Barnabé to describe the plantation. Barnabé replied in fluent Spanish, his accent even superior to Montagnac's, describing the layout of the fields, the construction of the buildings, the organization of the work teams. His vocabulary was extensive, his grammar perfect, his phrasing natural. Montagnac then tried German, a language he knew less well. Barnabé switched effortlessly, maintaining the same descriptive flow. When Montagnac ran out of languages he could verify, he pulled a book from his shelf, a medical text he had bought but never fully studied. He opened it at random and showed Barnabé a page on human anatomy, specifically the circulatory system. "Look at this for 30 seconds, Montagnac said. "Then I will close the book, and you will tell me what you have read." Barnabé studied the page with concentrated attention. Montagnac slowly counted to 30, then closed the book. "Now, recite what you saw." Barnabé began to speak, reproducing the text word for word, including technical terminology, footnotes, even the page number and publication information at the bottom. His recitation was perfect, delivered in the same even tone he used for everything, as if he were simply reading aloud a document only he could see. The demonstration continued for over an hour. Montignac tested him on mathematics, languages, memory challenges, logical puzzles. Each test confirmed what the testimonies had claimed. Barnabé's intellectual abilities surpassed anything Montignac had encountered in any human being, enslaved or free, educated or self-taught. This was not simply unusual intelligence. It was something that should not exist, a cognitive ability so far beyond normal human limits that it defied rational explanation. When the tests finally ended, Montignac dismissed Barnabé and sat alone in his office, trying to process what he had witnessed. His initial excitement at having acquired a valuable asset had transformed into something more complex. Barnabé was not just intelligent, he was intellectually superior to Montignac himself, superior to anyone Montignac had ever known. The implications were dizzying. Over the following weeks, Montignac found himself increasingly dependent on Barnabé's abilities. He began bringing him into his office daily, presenting him with problems and challenges, watching in astonishment as Barnabé solved them instantly. Plantation management questions that would normally require hours of calculation and deliberation, Barnabé answered in moments. Market projections, crop rotation strategy, optimal harvesting time, equipment repair diagnostics. Barnabé handled everything with effortless precision. Gaspard noticed the change and reported it to the other overseers. One evening in late December, Monsieur de Montignac spends more time with this new enslaved man than he does managing the plantation, Gaspard said, worry evident in his voice. 3 or 4 hours a day, they are shut together in that office. And I noticed something else. Monsieur de Montignac has started asking Barnabé's opinion before making decisions. He asked him yesterday if he should buy additional land that had been put up for sale. Barnabé looked at the figures for perhaps 2 minutes, then provided an analysis of soil quality, market conditions, and projected yields that took Monsieur de Montignac 3 days to verify, and every point Barnabé raised was correct. The second overseer, a younger man named Etienne, shook his head in disbelief. An enslaved person giving investment advice to one of Martinique's wealthiest planters. This is not right. This is not how it works. No, Gaspard assented. It is not, and I worry about where this is leading. Where it was leading became apparent in mid-January 1843. Montignac called Gaspard into his office and announced that he was restructuring the plantation's operations based on the recommendations Barnabé had provided. The changes were comprehensive, affecting everything from work team assignments to planting schedules and equipment maintenance protocols. Gaspard reviewed the proposals and had to admit they were logical, showing a sophisticated understanding of agricultural science and labor efficiency, but their source deeply troubled him. Sir, Gaspard said carefully, these are sound recommendations, but I must ask, are you comfortable implementing major operational changes based on the advice of an enslaved person? I am comfortable implementing changes that will increase our productivity and profits, Montignac retorted, his tone sharp. Barnabé's enslavement does not diminish the validity of his ideas. On the contrary, having access to his abilities gives us competitive advantages that other plantations do not have. But sir, the other workers notice. They see Barnabé spending hours in your office. They see you consulting him, relying on his judgment. This undermines the fundamental structure upon which we depend. How can we maintain authority when the enslaved people see one of their own operating as your advisor? Montignac had dismissed the concern, but Gaspard's words persisted. The fundamental structure. That phrase captured something essential about slavery that Montignac had always understood intellectually, but never questioned emotionally. The system demanded a strict hierarchy, an absolute distinction between owner and owned, master and enslaved. Master and intelligence threatened this distinction, suggested that categories were arbitrary rather than natural, and Barnabé's level of intelligence made that arbitrariness impossible to ignore. By February, the situation had further deteriorated. Montignac no longer merely consulted Barnabé, but actively sought his company, engaging him in conversations that went far beyond plantation business. He discussed philosophy, science, history, literature, Barnabé had absorbed more knowledge through his unusual memory than most university graduates acquired through formal education. He could discuss classical Greek philosophy, Renaissance art, contemporary political theory, all with the same depth and nuance that characterized his entire intellect. These conversations left Montagnac both exhilarated and deeply troubled. Exhilarated because he had finally found someone who could match his own intellectual interests, who could challenge his thinking and introduce perspectives he had never considered. Troubled because this someone was legally his property, a man he owned as completely as he owned furniture or livestock, but who was demonstrably more intelligent than he was. The contradiction became unbearable. Montagnac began to lose sleep, staying awake, trying to reconcile the reality of Barnabé's abilities with the legal and social structures that defined their relationship. How could he own someone more intelligent than himself? What did that mean for slavery, for racial hierarchies, for all the justifications colonial society offered for the system if someone like Barnabé existed? These questions had no comfortable answers, and Montagnac found himself avoiding them more and more by spending more time with Barnabé, as if the proximity of this remarkable mind could somehow resolve the contradictions through intellectual force alone. The other enslaved people at Belle Alliance had also begun to react differently to Barnabé. Despite his isolation, despite his refusal to socialize, they had observed his unusual relationship with Montagnac. News had spread about his intelligence, his abilities, how the master consulted him as an advisor rather than giving him orders like an enslaved person. Some viewed this with suspicion, wondering if Barnabé was collaborating with Montagnac against them. Others saw things differently, seeing in Barnabé's intelligence a possibility they had been taught to deny. Proof that the supposed natural order was not natural at all. A woman named Sarah, who worked in the main house kitchen and had occasion to observe both Montagnac and Barnabé, mentioned this to Gaspard one evening when he came to the kitchen for coffee. "This man Barnabé," she said softly, "he changes things just by being who he is. Monsieur de Montagnac cannot look at him without seeing something that contradicts everything he believes about us. And we cannot look at Barnabé without seeing proof that what they tell us about our limitations is a lie." "That is dangerous talk," Gaspard warned, though his tone carried more concern than threat. "It is true talk," said Sarah, "and truth is always dangerous for people who profit from lies." The situation reached its crisis point on March 3, 1843. Montagnac had called Barnabé into his office to review quarterly financial reports, a routine they had established weeks earlier. But this time, instead of presenting the reports immediately, Montagnac sat in silence for several minutes while Barnabé waited, standing. Finally, Montagnac spoke, his voice strained. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Do you understand the position your intelligence places me in?" "I am not certain what you mean, sir," Barnabé replied, though his tone suggested he understood perfectly. "I mean that I own you legally, completely. You are my property, yet you are intellectually superior to me in ways I cannot even fully measure. You solve problems I cannot solve. You understand concepts I can barely grasp. You see patterns and connections that exceed my own cognitive abilities. How am I supposed to reconcile these realities? How am I supposed to maintain the authority this system demands when I know with absolute certainty that you are more capable than I am?" The question hung in the air between them. Barnabé remained still, his expression neutral, waiting. When he spoke, his words were chosen with obvious care. "Sir, if I may speak freely, you may. The contradiction you are experiencing is not caused by me. It existed before you bought me, before you met me, before I was born. The contradiction is inherent in slavery itself. The system requires believing that enslaved people are inferior, naturally suited to servitude, incapable of the full humanity that would make their enslavement unjust. But this belief can only be maintained if the evidence that contradicts it is suppressed or ignored. My existence makes the evidence impossible to ignore. I do not create the contradiction. I merely make it visible." Montagnac listened with increasing agitation. "You say slavery is unjust. I say that possessing human beings requires justifications that cannot survive honest scrutiny. You asked me to speak freely, sir. That is what I am doing. And you believe you deserve freedom." Barnabé's expression was perhaps the first true emotion Montagnac had seen from him. "I believe all human beings deserve freedom, sir, but I also understand that this belief changes nothing about my situation. I exist within a legal and social structure that defines me as property, regardless of my abilities. What I believe about justice has no bearing on what will happen to me." The conversation ended shortly after, but it resonated in Montagnac's mind for days. He found himself unable to concentrate on plantation business, distracted by thoughts he had never allowed himself to seriously consider before. What if Barnabé was right? What if the justifications for slavery were lies, comfortable fictions maintained by willful ignorance? And if those justifications were lies, what did that make Montagnac himself? A man who had built his wealth on systematic injustice, who had profited from the suffering of people whose humanity he deliberately refused to acknowledge. These questions might have remained abstract philosophical problems were it not for what happened on March 15th. A group of abolitionists had distributed pamphlets in Saint-Pierre, documents arguing against slavery on moral and religious grounds. One of these pamphlets reached Belle Alliance, circulated among the workers in secret, and finally reached Barnabé. Gaspard discovered Barnabé reading it in the early morning before most workers were awake. The pamphlet presented arguments against slavery in terms blending moral philosophy, religious teaching, and practical analysis of the system's effects on society. Gaspard immediately confiscated it and brought it to Montagnac, explaining where he had found it and what Barnabé was doing. Montagnac examined the pamphlet with increasing fury, not fury at Barnabé, but fury at himself, because every argument in the document echoed the thoughts he had harbored since his conversation with Barnabé 2 weeks earlier. The pamphlet told him nothing he didn't already know. It merely articulated truths he was avoiding. He called Barnabé into his office that evening. "Gaspard found you reading abolitionist literature," Montagnac said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "Do you understand how dangerous this is? Possession of such a document by an enslaved person is illegal. I could have you whipped or sell you to the most brutal owner I can find." "Yes, sir," Barnabé said. "I understand the risks." "Then why take them?" "Because the pamphlet contained ideas worthy of being understood, sir. Sir, I read everything I encounter. It is my nature. I cannot selectively ignore information because it is dangerous." "And do you agree with what it says? Do you believe slavery should be abolished?" Barnabé held his gaze with that unsettling frankness. "Sir, I believe slavery is morally indefensible. I believe it corrupts everyone it touches, enslaved and master alike. I believe it will eventually destroy colonial society, and I believe you have reached the same conclusions. That is why my presence troubles you so deeply. I do not threaten you with violence or rebellion. I threaten you by making it impossible to avoid truths you have spent your life denying." The words struck Montagnac like physical blows. He stood abruptly, walked to his window, looked out at the plantation lands where over 100 human beings lived and worked under his authority, their labor generating his wealth, their suffering funding his comfortable existence. The sunset painted everything in a warm golden light, making it all peaceful, almost beautiful, but he could no longer unsee what Barnabé had forced him to see. He could not return to the comfortable certainties that once made this life seem natural and justified. "Leave," Montagnac said, his voice now barely a whisper. "Return to your quarters. I need to think." Barnabé left silently. Montagnac remained at the window long after nightfall, observing the slave cabins in the distance, seeing them differently than he ever had before. Not as housing for labor, but as prisons for people. Not as infrastructure necessary for agricultural production, but as monuments to systematic injustice. Barnabé had told him nothing revolutionary. He had simply made visible what had always been true. The next morning, Montagnac made a decision that would alter everything that followed. He called his notary, a man from Saint-Pierre named Maître Beaumont, who managed the legal affairs of several wealthy planters. Beaumont arrived 3 days later, and Montagnac met him privately in his office. "I need you to prepare manumission papers," Montagnac said, without preamble. Beaumont's surprise was evident. "For which enslaved person? Barnabé? The one you bought in December in Saint-Pierre?" "Yes." "May I ask why? Has he proven problematic?" "No. He has proven extraordinary, too extraordinary." "I cannot keep him, Beaumont. I have tried and I cannot. His intelligence makes the entire system visible in a way I cannot live with. I need him to be free." Beaumont had handled strange requests before, but this one was unprecedented. Monsieur de Montagnac, do you understand what you are saying? You paid 2,000 francs for this man less than 4 months ago. He is valuable, and you simply want to free him. I want to free him because keeping him enslaved is destroying me, Montagnac said, the words coming out with desperate intensity. Every day he remains here. Every conversation we have, every time I see him, I am confronted with the fundamental injustice of what I am doing. Not just to him, but to all of them. He has shown me things about slavery, about myself, that I can no longer ignore. The only way for me to continue functioning is for him to be gone. Then sell him, Beaumont suggested. Let someone else handle the complications. I cannot do that either. I cannot pass this problem to another person knowing what I know about him. That would make me complicit in his continued enslavement. The only ethical option is manumission. Beaumont tried to argue, explain the legal complications, the social repercussions, the financial loss. But Montagnac was unyielding. The papers were prepared over the next week. On March 28th, just over 3 months after buying Barnabé, Edouard de Montagnac signed the documents granting him freedom. The signing took place in Montagnac's office. Barnabé stood silently while Montagnac and Beaumont completed the necessary forms, his expression revealing nothing. When the papers were finished, Montagnac handed them to Barnabé along with 250 francs, more than the law required, but less than what seemed adequate for what Montagnac was trying to achieve. You are free, Montagnac said, the words feeling both inadequate and momentous. According to colonial regulations, you must register as a free man or leave the colony if you cannot find stable employment here. I suggest you leave for metropolitan France as soon as possible. Barnabé accepted the papers and the money, studying them briefly before looking up at Montagnac. Why? He simply asked. Why free me when you could have sold me for a profit? Because you were right, Montagnac said, his voice marked with an emotion he did not try to hide. About everything, about slavery, about the contradictions, about what your presence revealed. I cannot own someone who forced me to see truths I have spent my life avoiding. I cannot continue to profit from a system I now understand to be fundamentally evil. Freeing you does not absolve me of what I have done, of the wealth I built on slavery, of the lives I controlled and broke, but it is the only thing I can do that does not make me complicit in one more day of your enslavement. Barnabé absorbed this, his expression changing slightly, perhaps the closest he came to showing true emotion. And the others? He asked softly. The 143 people who remain enslaved here. What about their intelligence, their humanity, their right to freedom? The question cut to the heart of everything. Montagnac had no answer that would not reveal the inadequacy of his gesture. He was freeing one man while keeping over 100 others in chains. The contradiction was obvious and overwhelming. I do not know, Montagnac admitted. I do not know how to reconcile that. I do not know how to free them without destroying everything I have built, without facing financial ruin and social ostracism. I do not have enough courage for that. I can only do this one thing, and even this seems capable of destroying me. Barnabé slowly nodded, accepting the honesty, if not the justification. Then I thank you for my freedom, Monsieur de Montagnac, while acknowledging its incompleteness. Perhaps that is all any of us can do in this world. Take the small steps we can manage and hope they matter somehow. He turned and left the main house office, walked down the plantation road towards Saint-Pierre and toward the life that awaited him beyond his enslaved status. Montagnac watched from his window until Barnabé disappeared from his sight. Then he sat heavily in his armchair and tried to understand what he had just done and what it meant for everything that would follow. The story could have ended there, with Barnabé walking towards freedom and Montagnac left grappling with his compromised conscience. But what happened next would prove that freeing Barnabé had set in motion consequences far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. News of Barnabé's manumission spread throughout Belle Alliance plantation within hours. Sarah, the cook, spoke to the others that evening in cautious whispers. Monsieur de Montagnac freed him because Barnabé's intelligence made slavery impossible to justify, she said. Think about what that means. It means Montagnac knows. He knows the entire system is built on lies. He knows we are human beings who deserve freedom. Just like Barnabé, he freed one man because he could not deny his humanity. But what about ours? Are we less human, less deserving? These questions had no comfortable answers, but they circulated in the slave quarters, passed on in fragments of conversation during breaks, discussed in the precious private moments workers snatched from their monitored existence. Barnabé had only been with them for 3 months, had never spoken directly to most of them, had remained isolated. Yet his presence and subsequent freedom had fundamentally altered how they understood their own situation. Gaspar noticed the change immediately. Workers who had been docile for years began to ask questions, to hesitate before following orders, showing subtle signs of resistance that had not existed before. Nothing overt enough to warrant punishment, just a change in atmosphere. The sense that something fundamental had cracked within the plantation's social structure. He mentioned this to Montagnac. "The workers are agitated, sir. Barnabé's freedom has created expectations, raised questions about why he was freed and not the others. We must address this before it becomes more serious." Montagnac, who had been struggling with his own inner turmoil since signing the manumission, replied with uncharacteristic harshness. "What would you have me do, Gaspar? Explain that I freed Barnabé because his intelligence made me recognize the injustice of slavery, but I keep everyone else enslaved because I lack the courage to follow that recognition to its logical conclusion? How do I explain that without admitting I am a hypocrite and a coward?" The outburst shocked both men. Montagnac had never spoken so openly about his internal conflicts. "I apologize," Montagnac said after a moment. "Maintain standard discipline. If anyone becomes genuinely problematic, report it to me. Otherwise, continue normal operations." But normal operations proved impossible to maintain. Over the following weeks, small acts of resistance multiplied. Tools disappeared and reappeared in the wrong places. Work progressed slightly slower. Conversations abruptly ceased when overseers approached. The plantation functioned, but the efficiency and control that had characterized it for years had deteriorated. Montagnac found himself increasingly isolated, shunned by neighboring planters, who had heard of Barnabé's manumission and viewed him at best as an eccentric, at worst as a danger. One evening in late April, he received a visit from 3 plantation owners who claimed to be friends but whose purpose was clearly confrontation. They sat in Montagnac's office. The eldest, a man named Desrosiers, spoke first. "Edouard, we have known each other for years. Your decision to free this enslaved man, Barnabé, has created problems that extend beyond your plantation. The news has spread. Our workers have heard about it, have started asking questions. You have introduced instability throughout the entire region." "I freed one man," Montagnac replied, though his voice carried no real conviction. "One man in a region where thousands remain enslaved because you freed him after he demonstrated exceptional intelligence," another planter interjected. "You confirm what abolitionists in France are saying, that enslaved people are capable of intellectual achievement, that their enslavement is not based on natural inferiority, but on legal structures that could be changed. Every enslaved person who hears about Barnabé begins to wonder why intelligence should determine freedom." "Good," Montagnac said, surprising himself with his boldness. "Perhaps the system should be questioned." The 3 visitors exchanged glances. "Edouard, you sound like a follower of Schulcher," the third man said. "What have you become?" Montagnac stood and looked out his window. "I do not know what I have become. I know what I have seen. I know I can no longer comfortably profit from owning human beings while pretending that this ownership is natural." "No, then let me give you a certainty," Desrosiers said, hardening his tone. "If you continue on this path, you will be banished from this community. Your business relationships will dissolve. Your social standing will collapse and your plantation will go bankrupt because no one will trade with a man who has betrayed the interests of colonial society." The threat was clear. Montagnac understood that his wealth, his position, his entire life depended on loyalty to the continuation of slavery. To question the system meant sacrificing everything he had built. "I understand," he said softly. "Thank you for your clarity." The visitors left satisfied. Montagnac remained at his window late into the night, understanding that he faced an impossible choice. He could continue as before, accepting the hypocrisy of keeping people enslaved, knowing it was unjust, preserving his wealth at the cost of his conscience, or he could follow his nascent convictions, potentially free more workers, openly oppose slavery, and accept the social and financial destruction that would follow. He had freed Barnabé, believing it would quell his internal conflict. Instead, it had intensified everything, making the contradictions more visible and more painful. Barnabé had not only revealed the injustice of his own enslavement, he had illuminated the entire system. Meanwhile, Barnabé had left Saint-Pierre using his 250 francs and remarkable intelligence to navigate his new life. He bought passage on a merchant ship bound for Le Havre. The journey took weeks, each step requiring careful planning. Manumission papers meant little in a society that presumed every black man was enslaved unless proven otherwise. And Barnabé's intelligence, while valuable, also made him visible and potentially dangerous in the eyes of suspicious authorities. In Le Havre, while waiting to travel to Paris, Barnabé encountered a significant situation. He had taken temporary work unloading cargo on the docks to conserve his money. One afternoon, he overheard a conversation between two men discussing a mathematical problem related to shiploading and weight distribution. The calculations were complex, and the men struggled to determine if their cargo arrangement would keep the ship stable during the Atlantic crossing. Barnabé listened for a few minutes, then discreetly approached and offered a solution. He explained the calculation, demonstrated why their current plan created a dangerous imbalance, and suggested a modified arrangement. The men, initially wary of seeing a black man offer unsolicited advice, became increasingly attentive as they realized his solution was not only correct but showed an understanding of engineering principles they only partially grasped. One of them, a shipowner named Marchand, asked Barnabé directly, "How do you know these things?" "I remember everything I observed, sir," Barnabé replied. "I have watched ships being loaded, read books on naval engineering when I had access to them, observed patterns. Knowledge accumulates." Marchand studied him with keen interest. "You are educated." "I am self-taught, sir. I am also free." Barnabé showed his manumission papers. Marchand, impressed by Barnabé's abilities and recognizing potential value, offered him a job not as a laborer, but as a maritime logistics consultant, a role that would utilize his mathematical and analytical skills. The salary offered was modest by white standards of the time, but substantial for a recently freed black man, and the work would be conducted discreetly to avoid the social complications of a white merchant openly relying on a black man's intelligence. Barnabé accepted. He remained in Le Havre for several months, working with Marchand and other merchants, applying his abilities to complex logistical problems, earning money and building connections. During this period, he also began documenting his experiences, writing detailed accounts of slavery, manumission, and the peculiar position of being a free black man whose intelligence surpassed that of most white people he met. These writings, discovered much later, provide extraordinary insight into his perspective. In an entry dated May 20th, he reflected on what had happened at Belle Alliance plantation. "Monsieur de Montagnac freed me because my intelligence made the injustice of slavery unavoidable for him. He could not own someone demonstrably more capable than himself without confronting the arbitrary nature of our respective positions. His action reveals the fundamental limit of individual moral awakenings within systemic evil. He freed one man while keeping over 100 others enslaved, convinced that this partial gesture addressed the fundamental problems. It does not. It merely transfers the burden of contradiction from him to me. I am free because I was exceptional." What does that say about those who remain enslaved? That their intelligence is insufficient, that their humanity is less deserving of recognition. The logic condemns itself. But I doubt Monsieur de Montagnac will follow it to its conclusion. Most people cannot bear the full weight of their own moral knowledge. The observation was devastatingly accurate. At Belle Alliance, Montagnac was indeed battling this contradiction. The plantation continued to function. The workers remained enslaved. Sugar production continued, but Montagnac found himself unable to engage in it without an overwhelming awareness of what it meant. Every interaction reminded him that he was maintaining their servitude while knowing it was indefensible. His health began to deteriorate. He slept poorly, ate little, withdrew from social obligations. Gaspard and the other overseers worried but attributed it to social stress. They did not understand that the cause was deeper, that Montagnac was experiencing a psychological collapse triggered by the gap between what he knew and what he continued to do. On June 18, 1843, Montagnac made a decision that shocked everyone around him. He recalled his notary, Beaumont, and asked him to prepare documents for the gradual emancipation of every enslaved person on the plantation. Not immediate freedom, which would have been financially catastrophic and socially impossible, but a structured plan where workers would transition from slavery to paid labor over a 5-year period, with manumission granted in stages. Beaumont was terrified. Monsieur de Montagnac, what you are proposing is financial suicide. You will be ruined. Every planter on the island will see this as a betrayal. You will face violence from those who see emancipation as an encouragement to revolt. I am not asking for your opinion on whether to do it, Montagnac replied. I am ordering you to prepare the documents. If you refuse, I will find another notary. The documents were prepared. On June 25th, he assembled every enslaved person at Belle Alliance in the main courtyard and read the emancipation plan aloud. The announcement created a chaos of disbelief, hope, suspicion, and fear. Workers who had lived their entire lives in chains suddenly confronted the possibility of real freedom. The response from the surrounding community was immediate and vicious. Within 2 days, Montagnac found himself completely isolated. Merchants refused his business. Banks questioned his financial stability. His neighbors stopped speaking to him. By July, Montagnac's financial position became precarious. Without access to normal credit, running a plantation the size of Belle Alliance became extremely difficult. Equipment repairs could not be completed because suppliers refused to serve him. Sugar sales had to be negotiated through hostile intermediaries who charged excessive commissions. The workers, now promised future freedom but facing present instability, showed understandable confusion about how to navigate this transition. Gaspard, who had served Montagnac loyally for 8 years, tendered his resignation in mid-July. Sir, I believe it is best for both of us that I accept a position elsewhere, he said. Montagnac expected this. I understand. You have been an excellent overseer. May I speak frankly, sir? Please. What you are doing, this plan of gradual emancipation, it is admirable in some respects. It shows a moral courage most planters lack, but it is destroying you, destroying this plantation, and I am not certain it will truly help the people you are trying to free. They will be freed into a society that despises them, that will deny them opportunities. You are sacrificing everything for a gesture that might ultimately prove meaningless. The observation echoed Barnabé's written reflections. Montagnac acknowledged its accuracy. Perhaps you are right, he said, but I could not continue as before. Barnabé showed me something I could no longer ignore, and living with that knowledge, without doing anything, seemed worse than any consequence of action. Gaspard left Belle Alliance the following week. By August, Montagnac was attempting to manage the plantation almost alone. The situation was untenable. Meanwhile, Barnabé had left Le Havre and settled in Paris. In the capital, he found something approaching stability, took a clerical job for a merchant who valued intelligence beyond racial prejudice, and continued his writings. His reflections from this period show a growing awareness of his unique position. He was free, educated, extraordinarily intelligent, and black in a society that could not reconcile his attributes. Everywhere he went, people reacted with confusion or fascination. In an entry dated August 5, 1843, he wrote about the psychological burden of his abilities. Intelligence is commonly understood as an advantage. For enslaved people, this assumption is false. Intelligence in enslavement becomes a curse rather than a blessing. It means fully understanding the injustice of one's position, clearly seeing the mechanisms of one's oppression. Ignorance might have offered protection, a buffer against the full weight of circumstantial awareness. Intelligence offers no such mercy. Sometimes I wonder if my unusual memory is a gift or an affliction. Most people forget the worst moments of their lives, allow memory to soften suffering. I forget nothing. Every moment of enslavement remains perfectly preserved in my mind, every indignity available for recall with absolute clarity. Perhaps this is what made previous owners uncomfortable. Not my intelligence alone, but the feeling that I carried a perfect record of everything, that nothing could be forgotten, that every action taken against me would be preserved with absolute fidelity in a memory that never releases anything it captures. In Martinique, Montagnac's situation continued to deteriorate. By September, he had lost most of his workforce. Many enslaved people, promised future freedom but facing present instability, had fled. Montagnac did not pursue them. His plantation, once among the most productive, was barely functioning. The sugarcane fields were unharvested. Montagnac himself seemed to have aged several years in a few months. In late September, he received an unexpected letter. The handwriting was unfamiliar. The postmark indicated Paris, and the signature at the bottom was simply Barnabé. The letter, preserved in the Montagnac family papers, read, Monsieur de Montagnac, I am writing to you from Paris. I hope this letter finds you well, although I suspect from my understanding of colonial society that you are facing significant difficulties because of your decision to free me. I wish to tell you several things. First, I sincerely thank you for my freedom. Whatever the impetus for that decision, you gave me something precious that I had no legal right to expect. Secondly, I want to acknowledge the courage your actions demanded. Most people cannot act against their own interests, even when they recognize a moral necessity. You did so imperfectly, perhaps, but sincerely. That counts. Finally, I want to address what I suspect troubles you most deeply. You freed one man while keeping others enslaved, then attempted a broader emancipation only after facing criticism. You might question whether your actions were principled or merely reactive. I cannot answer for you. What I can say is this. Change rarely comes from pure motives or perfect conviction. It comes from the accumulation of pressure, from contradictions that become unbearable. You freed me because my existence made the injustice of slavery unavoidable. That does not diminish the act. I do not know what will become of you or your plantation. I hope you find ways to persist, but know that your actions mattered to me and will matter to others who learn this story. You were not perfect. You did not solve the problems you recognized, but you tried, and that attempt created possibilities that did not exist before. May you find peace with what follows. Respectfully, Barnabé. Montignac read the letter several times. It became something he continually returned to in the difficult months that followed. By December, exactly 1 year after buying Barnabé, Montignac had lost Belle Alliance plantation. Financial pressures had forced him into bankruptcy. The plantation was sold to cover debts purchased by a consortium of neighboring planters who had no interest in continuing the plan of gradual emancipation. The remaining workers were absorbed by other plantations, their promised freedom revoked. Montignac himself settled in Saint-Pierre, taking a modest clerical job, living in circumstances far removed from the wealth he had once commanded. He never fully recovered financially or socially from his attempt to act on his convictions, but entries in his journal suggest that he never regretted his attempt. In 1845, he wrote, "I bought Barnabé believing I was acquiring a valuable asset. Instead, I acquired a mirror that reflected truths I had spent my life avoiding. Intelligence was supposed to belong to us, the masters. It was proof of our natural superiority. Barnabé's existence proved that intelligence had nothing to do with race. I could not own him once I understood that. Freeing him did not solve the problem, but it was the only action I could take that did not require total self-deception. I lost everything by taking these steps. I would lose everything again rather than live with the alternative." Barnabé's life, after leaving the colonies, followed a trajectory few freed enslaved people of his era could have imagined. His intelligence, which had caused so much disruption in the slave system, proved equally disruptive in metropolitan society. In Paris, he settled while maintaining his employment with Marchand. His work involved complex calculations and problem-solving that normally required a great deal of time. But this success came at a cost. His employer insisted on keeping Barnabé's role ambiguous. White clients could not know that a black man was performing the analyses that their experts struggled with. Barnabé's intelligence had to remain invisible. In an entry from January 1844, he reflected, "Freedom granted me legal status as a human being rather than property, but it did not grant me the social permission to exist as an intelligent human being. My abilities must be hidden, attributed to others. In enslavement, my intelligence was a threat because it contradicted the justifications for my bondage. In freedom, my intelligence is a threat because it contradicts the justifications for my inferior social status. The legal situation changed. The fundamental problem remains." Barnabé lived until 1879, dying in Paris at the age of approximately 66. His brief, factual obituary identified him only as a black resident employed in various commercial capacities. It made no mention of his extraordinary intelligence, his writings on slavery, or his role in Montagnac's moral crisis. It was not until the late 20th century that his story emerged from the archives. The question his life poses remains acutely relevant. What does it mean that someone of extraordinary intelligence must be freed because his abilities make the injustice of slavery undeniable? While millions of people of ordinary intelligence remain enslaved because their mere humanity seems an insufficient justification for their liberation, what does it reveal about our society that Barnabé's exceptionalism was required for him to be recognized as deserving of freedom? These questions point to the fundamental problem Barnabé identified in his writings. Freedom, dignity, and justice should not depend on being exceptional. There should be universal rights granted to every human being, regardless of their abilities. The fact that Barnabé's intelligence was necessary for Martinique to recognize his humanity reveals how deeply slavery had corrupted the moral sensibilities of those who participated in it. In 1862, a historian interviewed Barnabé for a project on the experiences of former enslaved people. He stated, "I hope my story can serve a purpose beyond documenting individual exceptionalism. I hope it can illuminate the fundamental injustice of demanding exceptionalism for the recognition of humanity. Every person I knew in enslavement was fully human, deserving of freedom and dignity, whether their intelligence surpassed norms or not. My freedom should not have been caused by an essential difference between me and others. I was freed because a particular owner could not maintain his comfortable self-deception in the face of undeniable proof of my intellectual equality. That proof should never have been necessary. The sales register of December 7, 1842 still exists. Lot 43, Barnabé, 2,000 francs. This entry is more than a transaction record. It is proof of the systematic denial of human potential that slavery enacted every day." Barnabé's story challenges us to imagine a history where intelligence like his was not an anomaly requiring special explanation, but simply part of the range of human abilities present in all populations. Does extraordinary intelligence prove anything about injustice, or should mere humanity have been enough?